Welcome to our What a Lovely podcast where popular culture meets the First World War. I'm Angus Wallace and with me are Jessica Meyer and Chris Kempshall. I can't actually remember if we trailed this topic or because we're all up in the air on where we were going next, but in this episode we're going to be discussing the 2023 French TV series Women at War, Les Combattantes. It originally aired on TF1 in France and is now available on Netflix. Billed as a limited series, so there should not be a second season. Be interesting to see if there is. There are just 8 episodes and it cost €20 million to make. Set in France at the outbreak of the war, rather than the western end of the Western Front, the show's set at the eastern end close to the Swiss border. And to quote from the PR blurb, the destinies of 4 women intersect. Marguerite, a mysterious Parisian prostitute, Caroline, propelled to the head of the family factory, Agnes, mother superior of a requisitioned convent, and Suzanne, a feminist nurse. The 4 women find themselves in the town of Saint-Poulon, which lies just behind the French front lines. The artsdesk.com reviewer wrote, "It isn't exactly War and Peace, though it may be a bit Les Miserables, but Women at War is comfortably bingeable and has its sinews stiffened by strong performances from its excellent female cast. The men, it's fair to say, pale by comparison." I thought perhaps a quote from Joe Keller writing from The Decider might be an interesting place to start. Cecile Lawn, the creator, shows German soldiers killing defenceless women and children. It's not a surprise that French production might go in that direction, but it seemed unnecessarily harsh, especially for the first episode. So there's not a trench in sight throughout the whole of this series. There's very little mud. This is very much a French view of the war, in which case the scene Keller is talking about is right at the start, isn't it, where some German troops come out of the wood pursuing some French troops. They shoot the French troops and then in their sort of battle fury shoot down some women and children. Does this say more about the French perceptions of the war? I'm not sure such a scene would be in a British production.
I think maybe come back to the death of the women and children in the first episode. But one of the things that really struck me throughout, not just in the first episode, was that lack of trenches and the importance of woodland and mountains. You have mountains on fire in, I think it's either the penultimate or the ultimate or the final episode. The final battle takes place in a wood, in a stream, which had me at one point, or a creek of some sort, which had me at one point as a medical historian go, "Oh God, stomach wound in a dirty river. Ah!"
That's the worst time to get a stomach wound.
Well, they shouldn't have been moving anyway with a stomach wound, but that's beside the point. They always do. There's not much you can do, but it was more infection. Oh God, the risk of infection though. I thought that was fascinating. The different landscape they chose to set it in, and woods, and there's a cave that has an important role at one point. This is my question for Chris. I'm going to spend a lot of time asking Chris. How true is that of the French experience?
Well, there's a lack of front line, I was going to say as well, to add to that. There is no front line. It's actually quite vague. They blunder into it at times, be into one another's territory, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, when you get to the final battle bit where they're all kind of lined up behind some logs and they're like waiting for the Germans to arrive, they're not in a trench, they're in kind of like ramshackle defensive fortifications. It produced the idea that, of all of the wood, thank goodness the Germans are going to walk through this bit directly towards the prepared defenders. But then obviously they get shelled by artillery anyway, so they're having a reasonably bad day. I think it is reasonably true and I don't like the word act. I think it's interesting because certainly at this stage of the war you don't have wide scale trenches at all. Some of the chronology of the series is a little interesting and odd, and they move things forward and play around with things. I don't particularly care because they're going for the dramatic purposes. But in the early months of 1914, you're not digging trenches. You're not producing kind of big fortifications, and certainly in the early parts. Certainly the early years of the war, British soldiers and French soldiers have very different views on trenches in general. And the British complain a lot about the state of French trenches. And trenches is effectively used to, maybe a ditch in the ground or a creek, for example, with the final battle. And that, the French trenches are poorly designed, they're dirty, they're not very defensible, all of these things. And it represents a failure to understand what the trenches are for the French. Why would you build big deep fortifications for something you're not planning on staying in. The French are intending to be aggressive. They're intending to attack and force the Germans back off of the land that they've captured. They're not planning on sitting in these big defensible fortifications, so they're not going to build them. So I find that interesting in that, it's not a war of movement, but it's not a war of trenches either in this time period. And I like the fact that occasionally, it's sometimes a little weird, here are some random Germans who just happen to have stumbled out of a forest into somebody. And are you going back? What's the plan now? You seem to, several of you seem to have disappeared. That and characters talk about the German sector as an area of land that is known to have Germans in it, but apparently everyone's just kind of hanging around there. No one's moving yet, but no one's digging in yet, which I found quite interesting and quite fun. I found the whole series quite fun.
I really enjoyed the series. So I thought it was, that lack of sort of front line that you mentioned, Angus, I thought was really interesting in terms of evoking the sense of occupation, which we tend to forget that big bits of France were occupied by the Germans during this war. And there's some really interesting academic literature on occupation and the experience under occupation for the First World War, which we tend to forget about. And I thought that was evoked, and also refugees in the final couple of episodes where they're evacuating Saint-Paulin. I wanted more panic among the refugees. I think they seem very organized, and at least one woman was wandering around without any luggage at all. And I thought, really? One of the things you get a lot of in First World War letters and diaries from the British as they land and they're traveling through France is the descriptions of refugees throughout, and this is throughout the war, of the French population on the move and the Belgian population as well on the move throughout this. And I really liked actually that sense of the war pushing people out of their domestic spaces. And I think that the invasion of the home, which is coming back to that opening episode, where the first thing you have is a whole lot of Germans running into a farm and killing the women and children there. That felt, to me, authentic.
The location of it is interesting as well, because, Angus, you were saying, it's near the Swiss border. So actually, a lot of the action is nowhere near. It's all happening up north. You get a vague reference at one point to Joffre, stopping them near the Marne at one point in a kind of, actually the main part of the fighting is happening way, way off to the north in the kind of the main invasion corridor. So actually what's going on down south is a little bit of a sideshow, which I suppose helps a little bit in keeping that stability of, the Germans are near enough by that it's dangerous, but they're not heading for Paris through this little town near the Swiss border.
Although they are at one point in episode 2.
But the general does sort of make everyone aware that, that they're not top of everyone's list for the extra battalions that are on the way to help them. They're quite low down in the pecking order. The character, Suzanne, is on the run from the police, isn't she, as an abortionist? They can see the Swiss border, kind of the mountains in the distance, so they are almost there, and then that's almost the only time it ever gets referred to it. They seem in the rest of the series to slip further away from the Swiss border, which I thought was interesting, because I assumed there was fighting all the way up to the Swiss border, otherwise they'd be going around each other's flanks.
Yeah, there's a mention at one point too, like the last train to Geneva, or something like that, where Suzanne with the doctor is like, did you miss your train? And she's like, no, I chose to come back. If people haven't watched it, I was originally going to describe this as it's a soap opera set in the First World War, but in the spectrum of soap operas, it's very much at the telenovela end of it. You get these really funny twists and shocking moments of characters suddenly turning out to be something different and the like, which makes it really enjoyable, but it does make it really weirdly, surreally funny. Was go, oh, I'm your husband, and I'm a spy, and oh no, somebody else has arrived, and it's what's happening? What's going on? This is just getting a little silly now.
The only silly bit that really grated me, because I thought it was fabulous, was the vaguely annoying French detective who's a bit like the Terminator, who just keeps coming back time after time after time, and he's dreadfully wooden.
Well, he's there for exposition, isn't he? He's there to tell you who these people are from France. Because the first thing he does is tell you that Marguerite is a prostitute, almost within sort of 2 minutes of the opening. They tried to get, and maybe this is an aspect of it being a limited series, they tried to get every single issue you possibly could, from, abortion, sex abuse in the church, drug use, all of which are fascinating. in the war context, and there's sort of no room to expand. There was sort of too much in there. The German wounded disappear. There's this fascinating German wounded character who turns up, is it right at the end of episode 1, and then disappears by the end of episode 3. And you're going, I want to know more about him. He's really interesting, this traumatized German. Does he try and rejoin the Germans? He
nearly rejoins the French.
Yeah, I know, at one point. There's shell shock and the really interesting visual representations of shell shock. There was just too much for a limited series to do. This was sort of 3 seasons worth of...
Like, crammed it in.
Yeah.
In that respect, it keeps you cracking along, continually slapped around the face with what's new so you can forget any plot holes that have happened. It's a bit like that 24 syndrome where they will just keep everything rolling at top speed so you don't see any of the plot holes.
Yeah, and then blam, plot twist.
Not that I'm sure there are particularly. You're not left wondering about too many things. It does all sort of wrap itself up.
It's not so much plot holes. It's just sort of it hints at a backstory, which would be quite interesting to explore that never, Caroline, who's leading
DeWitt,
the factory owner,
who's a former prostitute and a friend of Marguerite's, who then marries Vincent DeWitt. And I wanted to know a hell of a lot more about the background to their relationship, because there's an implication that she marries him purely for utility, except she also marries him for love. And he knows about her background.
And it turns out she was a lover of Marguerite.
Yeah, exactly. There's sort of huge levels of background information about all the characters. They're really quite well-written characters, but you want to know a lot more about them. And I do wish this had been a multi-series. And you were saying, Angus, that the production and the cast were involved, the production crew and the cast were involved in a previous series set in 1890. And you almost wonder if that sort of forms the background for what they then went on to do with this, but you don't necessarily know that you need to watch the 1890 bit to get there.
Yeah, building upon it. Do you think, returning to that question of showing the brutality of the atrocities, does that need to be in a French production? Do you think we'd get that in a British production? I wondered if they put that in almost as a justification of the French going to war. Look how awful the Germans were and barbaric. And this is why so many of our men were killed, because we were fighting a barbaric foe. Which then I thought was a bit odd 100 and something years later when Germany is our friend kind of thing.
And this is where I effectively become a largely useless historian, kind of wondering exactly how much of that still exists within the French memory and concept of the war, the fact of being occupied, or whether or not there's like a Second World War reflecting on it, that kind of reconsideration of occupation that just doesn't exist. As Jessica was saying earlier, you get refugees in British diary accounts, and the idea that we did this for Belgium, and when they were tying nuns to church bells and but I don't necessarily know if civilians in France exist very much in modern British memory.
But I wonder how much in a British production you might get something about the atrocity literature, because that is very much part of the British memory of the war. But I think it would be framed not as reality, but as propaganda. And I have to say, we're recording this in the midst of a war going on in the Middle East where propaganda is very much to the fore. And I'm having, every time I switch on the radio and hear, a spokesman for either side at the moment, I'm referring back to the propaganda wars of 1914-15. This is what happens in war, right? Is that any atrocity gets rewritten to justify the side that is doing the telling. So in Leeds Special Collections, we have a Lusitania medal, which we bring out to show to students, or we did during the centenary period. We bring out to show for students because it's actually, turns out it's a British copy, and I'm doing air quotations for our listeners, of a German medal celebrating the sinking of the Lusitania. Except there's absolutely no evidence that Germany ever produced a medal to celebrate. This was a piece of British propaganda that's produced in 1915 to try and reinforce support of the war at a moment where it's not going terribly well for the Allies. So I think the atrocity the memory of the atrocities is there, but as propaganda in the British case, rather than reality for the French.
I wondered if it also if it worked to show, sort of the cowardly German committing atrocities against French innocents. But at the same time, it then raises the stature of the female characters to say, look at these brave French women who are actively at the front fighting. Suzanne goes back to the house where the atrocities happened. It's a bit of a grey area where that house is at that point in time when she returns. Is it behind the lines? Is it kind of no man's land? And there is constantly this sort of interaction with a sort of no man's land, as we said before. There's no front line. But these women are in that area, that space.
So in that first episode because the Germans are kind of stumble across the farm and there are some French soldiers there and they shoot at each other and the French soldiers get killed. My viewing of it was that certainly in what's going on outside of the house to begin with is that I think it's one of the daughters gets killed largely by accident. There's somebody here in the middle of a firefight and one of the Germans shoots her. Then they attempt to rape the mother, I think, outside, and she gets killed. And then the two of the characters end up on the inside, and we never actually see what happens in that room except for they both die and one of the Germans dies. So you kind of get this escalating. Yeah,
we hear a gunshot and it all goes black, isn't?
So there's this kind of escalating from accident to intended violence to whatever happened in that room is what happened in that room. And I wonder whether or not it's their design, not simply to show kind of like the beastliness of the Germans, because various of the French characters are pretty beastly as well.
And there's a nice German at the end who protects.
And there's a nice German at the end, and there's the German who goes into the hospital, who has a connection with the Mother Superior. Or just to show like war is increasingly brutalizing. Both accidents and violence happen by accident and design. There aren't many characters who come out of this looking particularly good, which is one of the reasons why it's so interesting, because the characters are all incredibly well rounded.
Although, can I just say how much I resented the fact that Charles de Witt redeemed himself at the end? That made me really cross.
Yeah, God, I hated that guy.
I just wanted him to be evil throughout.
Yeah. Just slink off somewhere into behind the lines.
I could deal with Marcel redeeming himself to some extent, but I was furious about Charles de Witt.
And also, why did he pick that hand? If you're going to smash one of your hands together, I'd pick the one that you don't use every day. The army still aren't going to want you.
Was he left-handed, perhaps?
I don't think he was. Although he fires his revolver left-handed at the end of the show, but I can't remember which hand he's using for other things.
So for listeners who haven't seen it, Charles tries to get out of the army by basically smashing his hand up.
Yeah, after a huge Machiavellian plot where he's been fired from the War Office, but he's lied to his family about it. So he's come home to take over the factory, but he can't take over the factory because all of the workers have gone. So he's going to have to... And it just this increases. Well,
he can only take over the factory if it's part of the war effort, so he keeps trying to revert it from a vehicle production factory to a munitions factory. Why the War Office wouldn't take over a vehicle production factory as is anyway?
Yeah, because they don't want to at the start. It has to be sold to the general that actually, vehicles and ambulances might be useful. But fortunately, Charles has got an old friend who's a pimp with a scarred eye, and he'll put up the money.
But just going back to something you mentioned earlier, Angus, which is, the status of these women at the front in the battle, which I think, that's the main part. One of the things I found really interesting was, so it's a Netflix production. I watched it in French with the subtitles, and some of the translations. First of all, I've never, and I watched Lupin on Netflix as well. But the extent to which they editorialize the music choices is extraordinary. There's one point where it's saying, hopeful music plays, or positive music. It was some extraordinary adjective that they used to describe the music. Lots of ominous music plays going on. And some of the translations, I would have said, aren't accurate, aren't precise enough, but it was useful having them because I don't speak French that fast. The translation of the title is really interesting because it's playing on that idea of what is a combatant. And of course, we don't gender in the way that the French does. So you can't say the combatants. You can't translate it that way and make it female. that was I found really interesting, because I think in the French original, that's the point of that title.
This sort of all plays into the idea of that levy en masse, how you've got to step forward to fulfill your right as a citizen to help the country, and then you can return to work. The whole Cincinnatus and ploughshare thing that Boris Johnson was waffling on around a few months ago. But what it occurred to me was, if you look at the sort of the hierarchy from the idea of war memorials and memory and things, combatants are at the top. The women are not necessarily in that same role from the point of view as memory. But if you think about how they're mobilizing everybody, suddenly the women are being mobilized, but they're not mobilized as the sort of the original levy to make tents and bandages. These women are put on the front line and they are made combatants. So at which point they're almost, they're up there to be memorialized with the soldiers.
So this is where I think the French specificity comes in. And Chris, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm basing this on my knowledge of other people's work on the subject. But since the Franco-Prussian War of the 1870s, you've got this concept of the l'impôt de sang, the debt of blood, that everyone as a citizen, male or female, and this is drawing on the Republican narratives in France, the idea of what makes a citoyen or citoyenne, you have both. And if men give blood through shedding it in the battlefield, women give blood through sacrificing their sons, which you have literally in Marguerite, whose son is in the army. So Caroline's husband is shedding blood. And, by implication, they're rather complicated plot ways in which Agnès and Suzanne are giving blood to the nation in different ways. So I think that there is perhaps a French specificity at play here that may not transfer across to Anglo-Saxon understandings. There's more here that a French audience might get.
And interestingly, there's a weird thing about various forms of media made by the French that are then renamed into English, and it's not quite right. So yeah, there is the role of the every soldier a citizen, every citizen a soldier thing, and that is not necessarily gender restricted. Everybody has to play their part in the Republic and defend la patrie, which I think makes Les Combattantes probably a reasonably understandable concept in France, in the way that women in war just isn't really the same thing. But we've had episodes in the past where we discussed the computer game Valiant Hearts. The French title for that is Soldat Inconnu. Valiant Hearts is not the translation of Soldat Inconnu. You could call it Unknown Soldiers and it would work fine, but for some reason they've switched it. At some point in the future, we're planning on playing the game The Grizzled. The French version of that is called Le Poilu, which again does not mean the same thing as the Grizzled. Le Poilu is a very complicated idea about kind of masculinity and hairiness and kind of devotion to the country, but it's just not quite right. And I wonder why some of these concepts are so difficult to translate in a way that is satisfactory.
The interesting thing about Valiant Hearts is I can see why they chose not to call it Soldat Inconnu, because the unknown soldier or unknown soldiers has quite a specific meaning in English. It's this idea of the untranslatable words. The way shock traumatique doesn't have the same meaning or impact that shell shock does when it's translated. It's not that what we refer to as shell shock didn't exist in France. It's that the language in which it's described doesn't translate. And I think the same is true. Les Combattantes has a meaning that's simply untranslatable in English.
I have to say, I think if you just call it The Combatants would probably be a more popular title.
It was interesting that the publicity was, this is the story of 4 women. And yet for much of it, there's so much else, partly because there's so much else going on, but there's so many other women. Eleanor who's Caroline's mother-in-law, has her own story. There's a novice at the convent who has her own story. And they're part of this as well. So I think identifying who the 4 women are who are at the center would have been much more difficult if you called it the combatants, because we also have Colin, we have quite a lot of men, including the general, who I loved. I thought he was a wonderfully rounded character. The ending was really interesting because it leaves you hanging as to whether he survives or not, which is fascinating. So there are enough men whose stories you are invested in that I think calling it the combatants would have been quite confusing in terms of the intent for an English-speaking audience.
Yeah, with the general, how interesting to have a general in the front line fighting alongside his men, getting wounded. He's not being an idiot 500 miles away in a chateau somewhere. He starts that way.
Yeah, he sends his son back to the front line.
Yeah, I did what he was doing there. Wondered what he was doing there, especially as he'd just given a couple of pints of blood, a few hours before as well.
The historical accuracy of the medical history is not perhaps brilliant. The transfusion was right, and I think that they wanted to get a blood transfusion in and to say, this is something that had been done in France, which it had, but the recovery time was perhaps a little bit for both for the donor and for the recipient.
They also mention, I watched this with a Belgian doctor, and it was a Belgian doctor who kind of showed how to, so like that for a throwaway line. That's pretty cool to actually link it into.
Yeah, no, I mean, a lot of the history is, I think, very good, but it's just they're trying to do too much in too short a space of time. I had a question for you, Chris. I don't know what Saint-Cyriens are. Are they the equivalent of a guards regiment?
I really don't know. I spent a lot of time thinking because I didn't watch with. I took the cop out approach of watching it dubbed in English, partly because the first evening I watched the first two chapters, I'd been writing until like 8 o'clock at night. It's like, I cannot read anymore, so I will just stare at screen humans and have them talk at me. But Saint-Cyrien, so whether or not, they're like some form of territorial guard unit or something, like, because they embrace this identity that Saint-Cyriens don't do X, or that there's some kind of internal dynamic, but I'm not sure. Shall I just look it up?
I was because the whole blood transfusion thing, we paused it halfway through to look up because it came up as a when did they do blood transfusions?
So the history of blood transfusions in the First World War is quite interesting because it's one of the very clear examples of inter-allied medical learning. As pointed out, this is done by Belgian doctors who then teach it not just to the French but to the British. But then the Canadians come over, bringing a new system, a more effective system. Is it blood typing that the Canadians bring? I'll have to double check that. I think it's knowledge of blood typing, but there's also a more effective system of rather than just sort of holding two arms together, which is where you are to begin with. And that gets taught to the British, who then teach it to the French and to the so there's this really interesting network of medical learning that's going on in the war. And it's one of those classic examples, along with plastic surgery, of the way in which war turbocharges medical innovation. It's the École Spatiale Militaire de Saint-Cyr. It's the French military academy. They study to vanquish is the translation of its motto.
They do study to vanquish. I remember that. Yeah, so maybe they consider themselves slightly elite.
They're cadet officers, which raises all sorts of really interesting questions about Colum's background, which never get answered. How this illegitimate son of a prostitute who's been chucked out of her family home ends up at what sounds like an elite, the equivalent of Sandhurst, I guess. Even if he does get reduced to the ranks eventually.
Yeah, whether or not he's been adopted.
He has a different surname.
Maybe he just turned out to be very good. You get a slightly different class system in the French army to the very, very specific one you get in the British army.
But would someone like Saint-Cyr take? I mean, how would you even apply if you were the impoverished son of a prostitute?
Yeah, dear Marshal Joffre.
Yeah.
I write to you from the house next to the Moulin Rouge.
Yeah, for all Napoleons, every soldier has a field marshal's baton in his haversack.
Yeah.
So it works that way.
No, it very much doesn't. Yeah, to an extent, that's the sign of a good drama show, when you're left kind of wanting to know more about some of the backgrounds of that. But there's also a frustrating element of like do a prequel or something. I want to find out stuff.
Yeah, good old Colin. It's such an unexciting name in English as Colin for a key character. If he was American, it'd be Mitch or Butch or something. We'd call him Henry or Harry. And French cook Colin.
We do have an Henri, don't we? The doctor's on. No, is he?
Joseph.
Joseph. Should we talk about religion?
I think we should talk about religion. This is not my area, so I think I've had similar conversations at times with Alison Fell, so to an extent, but I'm not 100% sure that the French army would be playing quite as well alongside the Catholic Church as is being depicted in this.
I was wondering about that.
Because there are various points during the war when being a Catholic officer is quite the impediment to, and certainly in the years before the war, Catholicism is viewed with a degree of suspicion by the French military.
And I do wonder the extent to which when the Mother Superior gets given a medal by Poincaré, by the president. And that was interesting that they decided to represent Poincaré as an actual historical individual on screen, that it is an honor for the church, that it is. And I'm wondering, where does loyalty to Rome lie in all of that? Isn't
that convent just told it was being requisitioned by the army in that first episode? Although I think she then just makes herself, we're at your service, but he kind of storms in and says, we're taking over.
Well, I think it must be a nursing order to begin with. Seems to be the implication.
Isn't there a bit of a song and dance made about there's no medical staff when Suzanne turns up and she makes herself available and he says, you're the only nurse I've got.
Yeah, that's true.
She turns up, he's a sort of super nurse.
Getting bloodstains out.
And the nuns just seem to be good at endlessly washing sheets.
Yes, perhaps you're right.
Scrubbing sheets, yeah.
But they're clearly not a closed order. They have contacts with the local community, and
they, of course, the male priest living with them.
One complex plot line down.
Where would we be without the male priest fiddling with the novices?
Trying to tackle sexual abuse in the church on top of everything else.
Yeah, which is resolved within maybe an episode and a half, tops.
Here's a question for you. Telephones. How likely do we think it would be that a rural convent would have a telephone?
Well, I did wonder that.
Yeah, their internet connection is probably not going to be great, so...
I internally justified it as, who has more money than anybody else? The church, so why would they not have a phone?
But I can't see why you put it in a convent. Unless I think that's why I got the idea that it's a nursing order.
Maybe she has a direct line to another convent, so maybe they have kind of, it's to chat to the other Mother Superiors.
It seems unlikely.
Chat rooms, 1914.
I don't know. This is when we need to get a historian of telephony in France. Actually, I do know a historian of French telephony. Come to think of it, I will go away and ask.
Please do.
Yeah, and come back in a few.
This is going to be a great callback in the next episode.
Yeah.
With the kind of you get a lot. It is largely civilian life with the war as a spectre on a background. You sometimes hear it, you sometimes see it, and bits and pieces like that. I wanted a little bit more union sacre going on, of not necessarily everybody binding together to support the war effort, which it does start to emerge at various bits and pieces. The wives of the husbands who are supposed to be safe with the jobs and who end up getting sent away, and they take over the factory, and they're a little grudging about it, which I thought was fine. But I wanted a little bit of, oh God, we all hate each other, but now we have to put aside our differences because the Germans here. I wanted a little bit more.
There was a little bit of that around the justification of the brothel, wasn't there? We need to be here because this is where the soldiers are. I'm an evil pimp, but you need me because it's war.
Have you seen my eye?
And there's a bit about, if you think about the factory, the women are not prepared to work in the factory take their husbands' places sort of until they sort of say to them, well, we can employ you. You've got to work for free, though, and then we can employ you. They're working not for the war effort. They're working because they need work.
And that, I think, does reflect a general attitude, not just in France, but in Britain as well. Someone's got to put food on the table, and it was interesting. There was only the one farmer. I would have loved to know more about what was going on the farms and access to food. We get, discussion of milk and eggs in the first episode, but then they kill that farmer and her child who's transporting the food into the town. Is the town suffering from lack of food? at any point because of this? Because of disruption to harvest? The need to put food on the table for these women is going to be the driving force, whatever their feelings about the Union Sacrée.
Yeah, you can't eat war enthusiasm.
Well, there didn't seem to be any rush to leave, did they? When they were out of work. They didn't up sticks and go to find work.
But where to? That's quite interesting because thinking about farms, there's R.H. Mottram's The Spanish Farm Trilogy, which is his 1921 to 1924 series of novels. And Mottram served as a translator, so he spends a lot of time with the French. He sets it on the Franco-Belgian border, so it's this funny farm that straddles the two borders and ends up in occupied territory. His heroine, Sophie van der Linden, doesn't leave, even when her husband is killed, until about the third novel. And then it's only when she cannot keep the farm going. And there is an element of, love of the land that Mottram depicts, that this is home. And we're slightly back to the current conflict of why don't people leave? Well, because this is where they exist and that defines them. But also, where else do they go? Because when Sophie does leave and she goes to Lyon, I think, at one point, she ends up having to prostitute herself to make ends meet because there's nothing there for her. And this is quite clearly a small, close community, rural community. Right at the end, the De Witts can go. Is it to Eleanor's sister? Was that it? I'm trying to remember.
Something like that. Yeah.
But they are middle class. So so where else these women would have to go is very unclear. Even Marguerite, who comes from Paris, or Suzanne, who comes from Paris, there's no sense that they have ties in the way that the women working in the factory have ties with Saint-Paulin, with that place. I thought we're back to that landscape, right? The evocation of place, I thought, was really impressive. And that felt very authentic.
Marguerite's a great driving instructor.
They did learn very fast, didn't they?
Yeah, seriously.
They're all amazing drivers. I mean, because Caroline bombing about in her little car. I liked Charles' little sports car with its circular window. That was
as he drove it, sweating heavily about whether or not to murder someone.
Although the only bit that got me, which is completely dead end to go down, was the fact that the lorries, the trucks, the ambulances that they were driving, drove down the road towards the front. Then they would stop to pick up injured, but there's nowhere for them to turn round.
Yeah, better luck doing a 3-point turn on that lane.
Exactly. All they could do is go further towards the front. And it was the only bit, every time they did it, I went, where do they turn round?
And there's no sort of Red Cross or anything to indicate that it's a medical collection point.
No, and it did. In fact, it amused me as well that the ambulances. So the ambulances are built for a brewery, aren't they? The brewery's requisitioned or whatever. The brewery can't pay, so they become ambulances. But I love the fact that they never bothered to paint out the brewery logo on the side of the ambulances. Yeah, they must have had the paint.
They just stick Red Cross on. Yeah,
they just put Red Crosses on the side. And I thought it was a lovely little touch as they're bumbling around in these ambulances.
No, I did like the conversion of the trucks to ambulances story. There was a lot of really interesting medical history in this one. There always is, bar the highly infected stomach wounds in the final scenes, and a very brutal blown off arm in the final episode, just sort of in passing, which was interesting. Another one of these storylines that they sort of start down the road and never elaborate on, except as a plot driver, is drug use.
Oh God, yeah, that's in there for 15 minutes and then reappears at the end.
Heroin use.
So heroin is this new drug, and I need to go away and do some more research on this, but heroin is a version of morphine, and morphine use and opium use are, rampant in the 19th century. We're not talking about a new drug here. I'm not sure quite where they're getting heroin as a new drug, and as opposed to what? Was it as opposed to cocaine?
Well, I thought cocaine was fairly freely available. Aren't they selling it to pills to frontline officers to keep them pepped up? Can't you get them sent over from London? And
yeah, the British are selling heroin. You can buy it at Howard's.
But I don't think heroin was something new and special the way it was being sold. But yeah, I wanted a lot more than kind of ranting about how nobody should use drugs.
There's some interesting French coded stuff in here as well. So you get a little snapshot of them doing the 1917 mutiny, of Colin striking a superior officer who's shooting his men and trying to force them to go forwards, which I thought it's almost like
into the gas.
Yeah. Which is happening months and months before it would have happened. It was at one point I was like, have we jumped to 1915 around April time?
But it felt a bit like almost a British coded one as well, because the reason he hits him is because the officer shoots the men for failing to go forward, and that's a classic. Their officer shot them in the back, and then to keep them from retreating thing that you get in the British literature.
So you get little snapshots of stuff like that, which is almost like, well, it's in there because you'd expect it to be in there. You'd expect there to be some gas in a First World War show. So here's some gas. You'd expect there to either be like a brutal officer or a little mini French uprising. So here it is. You'd expect there to be planes. So here's a guy with a plane who's half blind, but sure, why not?
Oh, no, not half blinded. It's the fact that he's got metal embedded in his head that keeps moving and causing him to pass out.
Because at one point the factory owner, her husband, who's an engineer and goes off and it turns out that actually he's not a particularly good factory owner because the books are in a horrible state. But he gets killed. Again, this might be where the dubbing causes an issue. But in the dub, he got killed because the Germans bombed the camp that he was in.
Yeah, that's in the original.
Bombed with what? Bombed isn't the same as shelled, which you might suspect, German artillery opened up on it. Bombed suggests dropped from planes. It's like, I don't think he did. Bearing in mind that, certainly the plane that they show, I don't think that's dropping any bombs.
They're accurate in the sense that he uses it for transport and then reconnaissance. There's no way that plane could pull out of a dive like the one they show. That's, even a Second World War plane would have struggled with that, let alone the bits of...
Yeah, that papier-mâché thing's going to get everyone killed.
This is the other major plot line, really. We've not really even touched upon the idea of spies.
But it turns out to be he's a good spy. He's just trying to get his daughter back.
But it's interesting because they almost set Marguerite up to be some sort of Mata Hari at the start. It's like, spies, Mata Hari, here we go. And it's not. She's tracing the troops to find her son. And then it turns out we've got another spy who we don't realise is a spy until... a bit later.
And I couldn't work out what was the motivation. So Jean Charrier is out looking for his daughter, but Jeanne Charrier, who is Jeanne Charrier, who we meet at the beginning before she's killed, is also a spy, not his actual wife. But what was her motivation? Why is she trying to get to the Swiss border? Because presumably there is a reason why she is willing to smuggle Suzanne to the Swiss border. Is it just because she's a proto-feminist who wants to help an abortionist? Or is it that there is a spying reason for doing this? But in that case, it's a different spying reason from the man whose surname is Charrier, whose first name I can't remember.
And that doesn't get resolved.
And we're never told any more about her. Again, more backstory that I'd love to know.
Was that actually her real name, though? Wasn't she taking an assumed name as well, though? Because hang on, I'll get quite confused. So he'd been living in Germany as the spy, hadn't he? With his wife and daughter.
No, he'd been living on the border.
Yeah.
Is that what it was?
Had become occupied and his daughter had been captured.
But he had been a French spy and turned through the capture of his daughter.
Yes.
So the woman who is...
But they both have the surname Charrier, which is why he turns up and says, Jeanne Charrier is my wife.
But she wasn't, because she's come from Paris.
Yes.
And they've been partners. They were both employed by French military intelligence, so they've been partners.
They've both got the same cover story. And Suzanne adopts the identity of Jean Charrier, which is why you then get the twist. As you said, Jessica is like, I'm her husband. It's like, gasp. But no, actually, it turns out it's not, because even the person that we thought was potentially his wife isn't his wife, because it's a cover story. It's drama all the way down.
I'm beginning to agree with Chris's definition of description of the telenovela.
Because it's all, no one's who you think they are, and then there's a shocking twist, and then there's a different part, and then, oh my God, you're my husband, and then hang on a second.
But you see, what's really interesting, because it's a Netflix series. I mean, I didn't quite binge it, but I certainly was watching episodes back to back. So you sort of miss some of the drama when you do that. the final reveal in the final minutes of the episode, and then you have to wait till the next episode, except it's going to start in 14 seconds.
So I was watching them two at a time. So which means that you don't end up with dramatic tension, you end up with it being quite funny.
So it means the only simple people in this, I don't mean simple, the only innocents in this, because you have two prostitutes, an abortionist and nun who breaks her vows, are the children. There's one who's shot at the start. There's the young girl who's the innocent who's told to run into the woods because the evil uncle wants to kill her. Is there another one? Or the kidnapped one? I've mentioned her already. But everybody else is really complicated. Any character who opens his mouth is not necessarily who they first appear to be.
There's also the Leon, who's the general's son and Joseph's younger brother, who plays the guitar and gets killed before he can become too complex a character.
Yeah, he goes swimming, which is a terrible choice.
No, he runs in to save his friend who's gone.
He does run in to save his friend, and then Colin runs in to grab him out.
Yes, swimming is a terrible choice on the front line.
I can't help but think the more we talk about this, the more we seem to making it confusing the listener to think it's not as good as it actually really is.
It is, and it's the complexity of the characters that make it good. The plot may be overcomplicated and melodramatic, but it's not just silly, it is actually really compelling because the characters are as complex as the plot is.
And it does work. I mean, you say we come out of it with lots and lots of questions and but that's fine. It works as a overarching narrative.
And it's genuine to, it's very French and it's about the First World War. It doesn't feel like one of these dramas that's been filtered through contemporary perceptions or understandings of the Second World War. It feels like it's about the period that it's set in. And that's really quite unusual, actually, if we look back at some of the things we've discussed over the years.
Yeah, it's certainly been absolutely one of the better things we've watched.
Well, I was thinking in the build up to this, we've had episodes in the past where we've watched a thing or we've read a thing and it's like, I will consider that to have been something that I watched and read for the rest of my life. And I enjoyed this. It was fun.
The letdown is we know that it's a limited series.
Yeah.
And we've all sort of said, God, I wonder if they do make a second one.
And I think the closing credits sort of put an end to that because it ends up, I mean, we've been doing spoilers throughout, right? But the final thing is women went on to serve in these roles throughout 4 years of war. This is dedicated to them, which is interesting because I think in an Anglo-Saxon production, you would have had that at the beginning rather than the end. Yeah, I'm with you, Angus. I think we've all gone too much plot for a limited series, but could we have more series rather than this is a silly series?
It was a good end. It was an end that ended.
But at the same time, part of me is fine with them going, and that's it. That's all you get.
I still want to know what happened to the general.
Yeah, but my concern is here's season 2. It's but is it going to be good? I don't want you to ruin what was fine. It does that snapshot of a moment in the war, and then that's all you get.
And I think the problem would be if you tried to do a sequel, you'd have to move it from that geographic space, which was kind of confined. So unless you did it in occupied...
Shift it up to Verdun.
An occupied territory, but then you've somehow got to get the characters back in who've left.
But actually, what you need is if this production team has done 1890 with different characters but the same actors, what you need is to now, move to occupied territory, do it for 1917, say. That would be fabulous. Say it's different characters but the same production company.
You could put 3 of them certainly back in the same geographic space. If Marguerite somehow got to the hospital, you've got the 2 women already at the hospital.
I think Marguerite was very dead.
But you never know. The
medical historian in me would get annoyed if Marguerite survived. It would be interesting to follow Caroline and Eleanor and what's the daughter's name? I can't remember. Into, as refugees. That would be fascinating. Or what happens to you could keep Suzanne and Mère-Agnès in the convent, and what happens when they're occupied. So you've got two potential storylines there, either way.
Absolutely fascinating. Well, shall we wrap it up there as we've got to the end of the series? Do we know what we're looking at next? I'm not sure we do.
I'm not sure we do. That feels very much like a January 2024 problem for the listeners. Because obviously it's Christmas Day listening to this now. So Merry Christmas, everybody.
What are we going to start the new year with? Who knows? We might even have War Hospital available.
Yeah, it's supposed to be beginning of 2024 now at some point. So yeah, maybe it'll be a different. One thing I think that we should consider based off of what we've had here, but also some things you were talking about with I think it was the Spanish Farm trilogy, and like is maybe do an episode on pop culture representations of prostitution in the war, because I bet there's loads to talk about with that.
There's some really interesting stuff in the Imperial War Museums to discuss around that, but we might need to supplement the website with images.
Yes.
That could be really interesting.
Well, we'll leave it there then. Thank you. Thank you, listener, for listening all year. Merry Christmas. And we'll see you in 2024.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Happy New Year.